and I'll keep letting folks in here. So, welcome to the webinar here. We're gonna get moving in a little bit here with the speakers, but because we're extension and we like to do, see how much we're actually passing along in terms of information. We've got a pre and post. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch a pre-quiz. Should be 7 questions. I just went ahead and launched it. So go ahead and fill this out if you're able to see the pop-up. For some of you, depending on your browser settings, you may not see the pop-up that is coming on here. And that's fine. No need. We're just trying to get an idea of the general audience, like how much you know beforehand, and then how much you've learned throughout the presentations that you're going to see today. So if any of you are just now getting in, please go ahead and check out the pop-up that's we've got here, the quiz. We'll give it another minute or two, and then we'll go ahead and get moving on to the presentations. Get them to then something. All right, we got 55 folks on. I'm seeing 19, 20, 25. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here in 30 seconds and we'll get moving. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. We'll go ahead and revisit all of this at the end when we have time. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A and like reviewing the pre-post. And with that, I think we're going to kick it off here with Dr. Erin Powell from FDAX. I don't know if you can go ahead and try and share your screen and presentation. All right. Okay. Yeah, you're muted too.
I had it full screen earlier. No, it's not looking like that. Oh, I had it on Edge, not on Chrome. Can you see that?
Yeah, it's not, well, we're still seeing your browser. Okay, and just one more housekeeping item before we go ahead and get kicked off here. A lot of, most of you here are probably trying to get CEUs. We want to make sure that everybody attends the whole way through. I will follow up with an independent, another quiz afterwards, and it'll have options for FDAX, FNGLA, FNGLA, LIAF, and just put your certification number on the right one that corresponds to you, and we'll go ahead and process all that for you. So just be on the lookout for that after we do the post quiz and we're in the Q&A. So with that, I wanted to pass things off here, covering the biology, more the general aspects of the topic at hand. We got Dr. Erin Powell here from FDAX. So take it away, Dr. Powell.
All right, thank you, John. So yes, my name's Erin Powell. I'm the curator of scale insects and whiteflies at the Florida Department of Agriculture Consumer Services. So essentially my role is to identify scale insects and whiteflies that are either present in the state of Florida or coming into the state of Florida. So we're inspecting nursery stock, fruits and vegetables that are coming in through the borders of the state. And essentially, I'm getting mailed a lot of bugs all day, every day, to identify and make sure that we don't have invasive species coming to Florida. But despite our best efforts with phytosanitary regulations, we do see a lot of invasive species coming into Florida, which I will kind of go over a little bit in this introduction. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the biology of scale insects, kind of, what scale insects look like in Florida, as far as species diversity, invasive species coming in, a little bit of a breakdown on what eats scale insects, what their life history kind of looks like, why they're such a big threat to agriculture, horticulture. So the scale insects are a superfamily. There's over 34 extant, so not extinct families in the world. So when we're talking about scale insects, we're kind of talking about this group of insects that are all related and they have some things in common. So for instance, they have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So they're taking these long stylets, kind of like a long straw, and piercing them into the plant. And they're either tapping into the plant phloem or they're tapping into the cellular contents of the plant, depending on what family of scale insects we're talking about. So scale insects are highly sexually dimorphic, meaning that the males and females look extremely different. So this makes them quite interesting in terms of insects in general. They're some of the most sexually dimorphic insects among all of the insects. So essentially we have a female that almost looks like a larva or a nymph, an immature, if you will, and then a male that looks more like a typical bug. So here we have two examples of males and females. So you'll see that the male has a pair of wings there, and the males have a single pair of wings. So for those of you familiar with the insect orders, this is similar to the Diptera or the flies, where they have a single pair of wings and then they have a pair of halteres. So these little like balancing organs that kind of hook into the wings. As you guys probably know, most insects have two pairs of wings. So if you think about a beetle or a butterfly or a wasp, they have four wings in total. So scale insects, among like adult insects, they're characterized by having a single claw. So if you look on the left, you can see like really high magnification images of ants or butterflies or horseflies, and you see that they have two claws at the end of their tarsus, or the foot, if you will. So scale insects will have a single claw there at the end. So if we're looking under the microscope, this is one way that we can tell the difference. For instance, if we're really confused and we're like, oh, maybe that's an aphid or a mealybug, we're not sure, then this can be an interesting way to quickly figure that out. So as I mentioned, adult females are neotenic. So this basically means that they look like immatures, even though they're sexually mature. So a lot of times scale insect people will lovingly call them pus bags. So they're almost like just kind of like a soft-bodied insect that's producing a lot of eggs. And we see that a lot of times they're, producing wax, and this wax can help be a protective layer against predators, but also against water loss because they have such a soft cuticle. If you think about, how hard a beetle is, for instance, scale insects are very, very soft-bodied. And as we'll learn later as well, this wax ends up being a great protective coating against pesticides as well. So as I mentioned, all of the scale insects are plant feeders. So among the order Hemiptera of those true bugs, there are some predatory true
Yeah.
bugs, but we have within the scale insects, they're all herbivores. So they have those piercing, sucking mouth parts that have these long stylets. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the left-hand side here, you can see some slide-mounted mealybugs, and you can see how long those stylets are. There's actually 4 of them that come out of the labium, and they're piercing into the plants. So if we're thinking about mealybugs and a lot of the other scale insects, they're tapping into the phloem of the plant. Whereas if we're thinking about armored scales, or you might know them as hard scales, they're actually tapping into the intracellular contents of the plants. So they're not really tapping into the phloem itself, but they're kind of probing into each cell, and that's why they'll cause these chlorotic yellow patterns when they're feeding. So these differences are interesting because armored scales or hard scales, they don't pass on viruses, plant viruses, because they're not tapping into that phloem. Whereas mealybugs can be terrible vectors of plant viruses because they're tapping directly into that phloem and being able to give the plants viruses essentially. So with these differences also comes differences in the biology where the scale insects that are feeding on the phloem, they're having to get rid of honeydew. So honeydew is this really high concentrated sugary substance that is essentially like a sugar poop. And as they're eating that phloem, the phloem is such a high concentration of sugar that they're having to get rid of that somehow. So we'll find that mealybugs and a lot of other the soft scales, for instance, they produce a lot of honeydew, and this can result in sooty mold growth as well. So sooty mold being a fungus that feeds on that honeydew. So that's where we'll see there's a lot of black on the plants in these heavy infestations because that honeydew has led to black sooty mold growth. And it also has a lot to do with their association with ants, which I'll talk a little bit about in a couple slides. Oh. So scale insects, generally, I talked about the differences between the sexes, but they can also have some interesting reproductive modes. So some of them, like cottony cushion scale, which is one of our kind of like famous scale insects, is actually hermaphroditic. So essentially, there's also species that are thought to be parthenogenic. So, which all this to say is scale insects can be even more notorious invaders because they don't necessarily need 2 individuals to show up in a new location to start a new population. So you can have one female that shows up on a fruit from another country, for instance, and she can start a whole new population on her own without a male coming with her. So this can make them even more notorious invaders for that reason. So as I mentioned, you can either have sexual or asexual parthenogenic reproduction among the scale insects. There's a lot of diversity that makes them really interesting to evolutionary biologists as well because of what they do with their sex chromosomes. They just kind of have come up with a lot of different ways to do the same thing. So a general life cycle of a scale insect. So because the adult females essentially look immature, they kind of have a confusing life cycle. So if we think of like a beetle goes through a holometabolous life cycle where you have the egg, the larva, the pupa, and the adult. And the same thing with the butterfly. You've got your egg, your larva or caterpillar, your pupa or chrysalis or cocoon, and then your adult. So scale insects are actually hemimetabolists. So means that they don't really have a pupal stage per se, but scale insects get weird and have to break some rules because the males actually do go through sort of a pupal phase where they have like a non-feeding stage where they're sitting around completely immobile, waiting to become adult males with wings. And then the adult females, they just kind of look a little bit bigger every time they molt or shed their skin. So in a lot of scale insects, you have the eggs, although some scales do give live birth. So the egg will actually hatch inside the female and they will deposit the nymphs onto the plant. But then you have the first instar, which is known as the crawler, and this is the mobile dispersal stage. So this is the stage of scale insects that's moving around the most, that's finding a new place to set up shop and to become their feeding site for the rest of their life. So essentially, by the time you have a second or third instar, fourth instar, like for like an armored scale, the armored scales, they actually lose their legs as an adult. So once they're settled, they're really settled. And I think a lot of times people think of scale insects as kind of like pitiful and, how are they such great invaders or how are they such bad plant pests? Like they can't even move. But it turns out they do move very, very well across the world and between plants. So among the scale insect families, if you think of armored, hard scales, soft scales, mealybugs, they have, different numbers of instars, but it's roughly a very similar life cycle where that first instar is the mobile dispersal stage, and then they get more and more sessile or, non-moving as they get older. So I've talked a little bit about the mouth parts already. We have these long piercing mouth parts that probe into the plant and either tap into the phloem or into the intracellular contents. So this is an infestation of armored scales. These are or the hard scales, the family Diaspididae. So this is one thing that you can look for if you're looking for an infestation of scale insects. So you might see some chlorosis or yellowing. So this is where they have probed into each of the plant cells and killed that cell. And one thing that I find like an easy way to spot an armored scale infestation in the field is kind of as you're walking around, you can almost see the sunlight coming through like palm leaves and see that chlorosis. And then I'll pop over there and say, oh, okay, well there's the armored scales. And these scales can only be a millimeter long sometimes. So you're really having to look for a lot of plant symptoms rather than looking for the actual bugs themselves, especially if it's an early infestation. So sooty mold, this is only going to apply to those scale insect families that do produce honeydew. So it won't be the armored or hard scales. This will be your soft scales, your mealybugs, your other more minor families that are producing a lot of honeydew that's promoting the growth of this fungus called sooty mold. So a lot of the scale insects are producing white wax. So these are some examples of mealybugs. And as I mentioned, this wax is important to protect against predators, but also to prevent desiccation or water loss because of their soft bodies. And scale insects have come up with, over evolutionary time, a billion different ways to make wax. So as a taxonomist who studies like the relationships between scales and looks at them on the microscope all day, this is what I really focus in on is how do they make their wax? Because they have all of these different little intricate pores and tubes, ducts that allow them to make a lot of different kinds of wax and kind of differentiate the species. Scale insects may be very inconspicuous. So this is an armored scale on the underside of a magnolia leaf. So you can see how hard it would be to see it under the trichomes of that leaf. You kind of have to dig it out. So a lot of times the plant will kind of grow over the scale because the scale is there for weeks or months, not moving. So this will happen like on the leaves like this, but also on the bark. So some armored scales will end up on the bark and they'll almost be like mining under the bark because the bark is actually growing up over them. So scale insects are often tended by ants. So sometimes we actually find our infestations by watching where the ants are going. The ants are tending them, so they're kind of protecting them to get that resource that they want, which is honeydew. So the ants like to go and be able to feed on that really high sugar, rich resource. And they will protect the scale insects from other natural enemies or predators because they want that source of honeydew. So the first example was kind of ants all over the world with scales, and these are some Florida-specific ones. So you can see that they're just kind of going and eating those little droplets of honeydew, but that's not going to happen with your armored scales because they're not producing honeydew. Although armored scales do have some bizarre relationships with ants. There are some ant colonies that actually keep armored scales underground in their nests and they keep them naked. They actually eat the wax off of them, and we don't really fully understand why because it doesn't seem like the wax is that like nutritionally valuable, but it's a fascinating story. So bees will also tap into this resource. If you ever see giant pine or giant pine scales, they occur in Greece and Turkey. And if you ever see what's called pine honey, it may actually be that honeybees have gone and directly eaten the honeydew off of these scale insects and used that instead of floral nectar to make their honey, which is kind of neat. It's always frustrating as a scale insect person because I want pine honey that's genuinely from scale insects, but they never want to actually explicitly say on the internet that it is from scale insect poop because I think it's probably not good advertising. So natural enemies, I think that Dr. Osborne is going to talk more about this, so I will kind of glaze over it a little bit. But essentially, we have a lot of different predators or natural enemies, these or biological controls, if you will, that attack scale insects. So a lot of times we'll see kind of these exit holes in the scales where the wasp parasitoids have emerged. So those wasps are laying their eggs inside of a live scale, and then the larva is developing and pupating inside and then emerging as an adult. So this is kind of just some examples of what you might see if you have parasitoid activity. And it's going to be really important, and I'm sure Dr. Osborne will go over this as well, but really important to be, when you're scouting, that you want to be conserving those natural enemies. You want to be taking into consideration, what nature is giving you as far as control measures, and wanting to keep them in consideration when you're treating for scales. So this is a cool example of, so when I'm identifying scale insects, when we're studying scale insects, they have to be cleared and slide mounted. So essentially, they're being put into a chemical bath and heated up, so that all of the guts and wax can be cleared out of them. And sometimes we actually find that the parasitoid wasps can be mounted inside of them. So this is a slide mounted armored scale. So I think you guys can see my cursor. I hope so. So I'm kind of putting my cursor around the adult female's body of the scale. So these are her mouth parts, these long stringy stylets. It's her other part of her mouth parts. And this is a wasp that's actually developing inside of her and would have emerged if everyone had survived. And what's really cool is we also have a first instar crawler that had hatched inside of her as well. So we have both a baby and a wasp mounted inside of that adult female, which is pretty neat. So other examples of natural enemies may be coccinellid or ladybug larvae. And a lot of times people mistake these for mealybugs themselves. So sometimes I'll get samples and people think they have a plant pest problem because they see this one gigantic mealybug crawling around on their plant, but it is actually a ladybug larva that's mimicking a mealybug. So one really easy way to quickly differentiate um, actual scale insects from mimics like this is that these coccinellid ladybug larvae, they're beetle babies, basically. They're the larvae of beetles, and they have a sclerotized head capsule. So their heads are kind of round and hard, and they have a chewing mouth part. So chewing mouth parts versus a soft head on a scale insect and those piercing, sucking stylet mouth parts. So if you just flip them over, it can be pretty easy to see with the naked eye or even a hand lens to differentiate them. So again, how do we know this isn't a mealybug? We would look at the head, and the eyes are also different, if you could see them. So a little bit clearer view. You've got that really hard head with some really distinct eyes and chewing mouth parts. We also have predatory Lepidoptera larvae. So this is Latilia coccidivora eating cochineal scale. So they'll actually be living kind of amongst the infestation of scales, just kind of chowing down, and then you'll have moths emerge. We also have predatory flies like chamomyids, aka the aphid flies. This one in particular is from a Lebec mealybug infestation on citrus. Lacewing larvae. Lacewing larvae can be important predators of scale insects. They also kind of have these piercing, sucking mouth parts, and they'll go around and suck the guts out of mealybugs and other scales, and sometimes even incorporate the wax of the mealybugs into their dorsal trash packets. So if you ever think of like a trash bug walking around, a lot of times they put lichen on their back, but sometimes they'll even use the mealybug wax or the discarded prey, the actual mealybug bodies, to make that trash packet. It helps disguise them from ants and other things that might want to keep them away from the mealybugs. So I talked a little bit earlier about the mobile dispersal stage, that first instar crawler. So we think, oh gosh, scale insects, like they're so tiny. How are they even like moving around? The adult females, they don't have wings. How are they such great invaders? How are they spreading all over the world? How are they such devastating agricultural pests? Well, first of all, those crawlers, those first instars, not only can they just crawl, as the name implies, but they also get picked up by the wind. So that is one mode of dispersal, is as being moved around by the wind, because they are so incredibly tiny, they can just be blown around. And they also can use foracy. So foracy essentially is like a relationship between two animals. In this case, we're talking about insects, where one is just kind of hitching a ride on the other. So a really classic example of foracy might be mites riding around on a beetle. They're not actually hurting the beetle. They're just kind of using it as a train to get them to where they need to go faster than they could get there by themselves. And that's what the first instar crawlers of scales will do, is they have a phoretic relationship where they kind of hop on to flying insects and insects that can move faster than they can. And then they will be moved to new plant sources. And this is especially dangerous if that scale insect species is polyphagous, which means that they feed on a lot of different hosts. So they don't necessarily need to find a very specific host that they can feed on. They'll just kind of feed on anything. And that's where we find that a lot of the invasive scale insects that show up are highly polyphagous, meaning that they'll eat all sorts of different plants and they can really thrive on diverse hosts. So if you look at these pictures at the bottom here, this A, B, and C, these are scanning electron microscope images, SEM, of first instar crawlers, and that is the tip of their foot, so the tip of the tarsus. You can see that the tarsal digitals, or the kind of hairs at the tip of their feet, have suction cups on the end of them. So those suction cups allow them to grip on to other insects and ride around on them more easily. And unfortunately, all stages of scale insects, from the immatures to the adults, are moved around by humans. So because they're so tiny, I mean, we can have adults that are only a millimeter long. They're just incredibly inconspicuous, and they can be hidden under, the nodes of plants, inside the leaf sheaths of plants, under the calyxes of fruit. They're just very, very easily hidden. And despite, the best efforts like the USDA and FDACS, we really can only inspect a small percentage of all of the commodities that are coming into the country every day. I think the USDA only manages to inspect maybe like 1% of all of the plant commodities coming in, just because of the sheer amount. And you're like, well, it seems like they could be doing a better job. But if like for one example, I've been in an orchid nursery where there was probably millions of plants laying on tables, and you go in there looking for one specific armored scale, and it's just an enormous task to be looking for a millimeter long bug, in a greenhouse that has millions of orchids on tables. So it's just an extraordinary feat to inspect and to ensure that every single plant coming into the US or coming into Florida is clean. It's just impossible. So unfortunately, humans do spread around scale insects. So why are scale insects so important? We're having an entire webinar on them. They cost billions of dollars every year in product loss and control expenses. They're just devastating agricultural pests, and surprisingly so, because I think a lot of people don't even really know what scale insects are, let alone really understand what their impact is. So they're extremely common and widespread in greenhouses and landscapes, nurseries, orchards, forests. As I've mentioned earlier, they cause chlorosis of leaf material, so they'll cause twig dieback, wilting, basically reducing plant vigor by taking away resources from the plants. The honeydew and sooty mold can get so thick and so bad that it will affect photosynthesis of the plants. So if your leaves are just covered in sooty mold, you can't photosynthesize properly anymore. They'll also cause disease transmission, where they'll spread plant viruses through their mouth parts. So that can be particularly devastating. They're incredibly small, cryptic. You can have just one individual that's parthenogenic that starts a whole new population in a new area. They have a rapid generation time, and Dr. Osborne's going to talk more about the chemical control side of things. That's not really my expertise, but scale insects are notoriously resistant to pesticides. And when you have a new introduction of invasive species, these new plants that have never, interacted with this insect before are particularly susceptible to infestations. And it can take some time for the natural enemies in a community to recognize a new invasive species as a resource for them. So a lot of times what we find is we'll have a new invasive scale insect come into Florida, absolutely explode in population and be devastating for a few years. And then finally, the natural enemies and biological controls kind of catch up with it and recognize it as a food source and kind of can check back that population. But it can take some time, and it can be particularly devastating to the horticultural commodities in the meantime. So scale insects, again, very inconspicuous, not really a particularly well-known bug in the grand scheme of things, but they actually drove the earliest efforts for biological control in the United States. When the cottony cushion scale came, they realized that they needed to find natural enemies that would control it. So this started off, kind of kicked off biological control in the US in many ways. Despite only having just over 8,000 species of scale insects compared to hundreds of thousands of species of beetles, for instance, scale insects comprise 12% of all of the USDA insect interceptions, which is just proportionally, it's incredibly disproportionate, basically. It's just, it's kind of incredible if you think about the numbers. And scale insects helped to motivate Congress to pass the Plant Quarantine Act of 1912 because of the introduction of the San Jose scale. So San Jose scale came over from Asia and it absolutely devastated fruit trees in California in the late 1800s and very rapidly spread across the United States. It was also one of the first records of insecticide resistance. They were spraying it with a lime sulfur spray and it was just surviving and doing great. So this was an interesting example of how it actually motivated a lot of our phytosanitary regulations. Is the scale insects were the reason behind them because of how devastating they've been. So in 2005, this paper reported that there was 255 invasive scale insects in the United States at the time. 20 years later, we have about 295 species of invasive scale insects in the United States. In that last 20 years, we get about 1.4 new species per year introduced to the US, and most of those we consider to be pest species. So of all of the scale insect families, we're seeing that the armored scales or the hard scales are disproportionately, we have higher numbers of invasive species of that family in the US, which is not terribly surprising because it's the most speciose or diverse family of scale insects. And that's followed by the mealybugs and the soft scales, and then some of our minor scales like the pit scales, the root mealybugs, the bark scales, etc. So where are the invasive scale insects coming from? For a long time, we were getting a lot of our invasive scale insects from Europe or the Palearctic regions. And this was a lot to do with just because of, colonialism, where we were bringing in a lot of commodities from Europe as we colonized the United States. These days, we are doing a lot of trade with neotropical regions like South America and the Oriental regions, so some of the Asian countries. And in turn, we have seen a shift in the scale insect origins where they were coming mostly from Europe to now coming a lot from neotropical or Oriental regions. So of all the scale insects invading the United States, where are they going? So California and Florida comprise most of the first records. So when we're finding that a new scale insect species has arrived in the United States from Asia, for instance, they're usually being detected first in California or Florida. And we're finding actually that California has had a decline in the last 20 years of new species introductions, whereas Florida has had an increase. And it's also interesting to watch how those phytosanitary measures have aided in reducing the number of invasive scale insects. So even though we do still steadily see new species coming into the US, there has been a marked decline after those regulations were put into place and after the USDA and state agencies like FDACS that I work for started doing more inspections of plant material and nurseries. So what are the major hosts impacted or at risk? I kind of defined the word polyphagous for you a few minutes ago. So for the purposes of this graph, I'm defining polyphagous as feeding on 10 or more host plant families. Essentially what we find is that a lot of these new invasive scale insect species that are coming to the United States, they're highly polyphagous. So they're really not picky. They'll feed on a ton of different host species. And this is really problematic because it doesn't take much for them to be able to find a suitable host. And then one interesting trend that I found is in the last 20 years, we have a higher number of grass specialists. So scale insects that specialize on grasses, particularly bamboos, have been invading the US a little bit more in the last 20 years. So it's just kind of interesting to watch these pathways where it's like, well, what commodities do we need to focus on inspecting more to look for these invasive species? And certain things, come up and down in popularity. If bamboos are just kind of seeing a surge in popularity in the ornamental trade, then we might also see more of their specialists accidentally invading the US. So I said earlier that scale insects cost billions of dollars in control and loss costs for the US every year. But it's really, really hard to determine or actually quantify the impact of the economic losses caused by scale insects. So we have tried, myself and one of my colleagues at the USDA, to kind of extrapolate some of these numbers. And unfortunately, what we've realized is that it's really difficult. Like it's almost impossible to actually quantify it, but we can say that, it's upwards of billions and billions of dollars a year cost by loss of plants because of the reduced plant vigor, the spread of viruses, and having to spend tons of money on pesticides and biological control agents to control invasive scale insects. So just to give you a couple of the kind of notable invasive scale insects in the past couple decades and things that you might want to keep an eye out for in Florida. Some of these things haven't arrived to Florida yet, and some of them are of very limited distribution. So they're only present in a couple of counties, for instance, or they're only present in South Florida, but we're watching them spread over time. So one interesting one that kind of is having also like a huge ecological impact in addition to potential economic losses is this flat grass scale. So this is an eclairiid, which is one of the minor families of scale insects. And this one is really interesting because it's actually causing like a huge dieback of the Phragmites grasses along the coasts of Louisiana and Texas. And I think a lot of times, we think of scale insects as affecting agricultural commodities, but in this case, it's actually allowing for more coastal erosion because that Phragmites is so important for kind of keeping the integrity of the coastline. So this is one we're expecting to probably creep into the coastline of Florida, especially up in the Panhandle on the west coast there. But it is not yet in Florida that we know of, but we need to do more surveys to ensure that it hasn't spread here yet. A big problem for citrus is Lebec mealybug. So this one was first found in Florida in 2009, and it's become a big issue on citrus, particularly because we've started using this like bag exclusion method for citrus. If you've driven through and seen the little like mesh white bags on citrus, that is to keep the Asian citrus psyllid out, to keep them from spreading citrus greening. But unfortunately, these tiny mealybugs get into the bags and thrive there because the bags are not only excluding psyllids, but they're also excluding natural enemies. So the wasps or the lacewing larvae or the beetle larvae that might be eating these guys, they can't get into the bags. So then the Lebec mealybug unfortunately does really well in there. And they can cause this extreme distortion of the fruit, premature fruit drop, and cause a really, really big mess. Phantasma scale, Dr. Osborne is going to focus on this one. This is a major pest of palms that was first found in South Florida in 2018 and has kind of been spreading throughout South and Central Florida. And it's not just found on palms. Unfortunately, we have records on mango, avocado, citrus even. So it's one to keep an eye out for. This species just showed up in South Florida in 2022. It's kind of an interesting story because it's native to the Oriental Asian regions, but it actually probably came to Florida from Costa Rica because it became invasive in Costa Rica, and then we actually saw the data from the USDA shift from where it was mostly being intercepted from Asia, and then it started being intercepted from Costa Rica all the time, even though we didn't have any actual official reports that it was present in Costa Rica yet. So it can be interesting watching, scale insects spread around the world, and you might not even have an official report in the literature that it's present in South America, but then all of a sudden we're seeing imports from South America coming in with this scale all the time. So it can be interesting watching those pathways and seeing where in the world they're coming from. So this scale is now present in, I believe, Palm Beach and Broward, maybe Miami-Dade. So those three South Florida counties. And this one's polyphagous. I'm mostly seeing it on ornamentals like Aglaonema and Dracaena. The crepe myrtle bark scale, this one is only in the Panhandle currently, but we are seeing it popping up in nurseries, especially on material coming from Alabama. So keep an eye on your crepe myrtles. This one could be particularly devastating just because we use crepe myrtle as such a big landscaping ornamental throughout North Florida at least. Hopefully it's something that's not going to really want to live in Florida. It seems to be more of a northern species, but there's always a potential for it to spread here. This is one of our brand new invasive scale insects that I first detected this year in January. We had an inspector send in a piece of mango that had like 4 or 5 different species of scale insects on just one cutting of mango. And this species is pretty inconspicuous. You can see that it kind of blends into the bark really, really well. And this was the first time that it had been found in the Western Hemisphere at all. And it was just on this very mature mango tree in a suburban Miami neighborhood. So we have no idea how long it's been there or how it got there. So this will be one to also keep an eye out for, see if it's going to spread or how widespread it already is. We have no idea. So what scale insects are concerning for the future for Florida or for the United States? This was an interesting study that came out in 2023 that was essentially using artificial intelligence to try to predict which scale insects would arrive in the United States next. And it used a lot of host and geographical distribution from a database called ScaleNet, which will be a great resource for all of you if you're looking to learn more about scales. But essentially, they predicted these top 10 species that would come to the US in the future. And by the time the article was written, they actually, 2 of them were actually already established in Florida, which were Planococcus minor and Nyphicoccus spiritus. So Lebec mealybug and one of our polyphagous ones that's really closely related to citrus mealybug. So it was kind of like fortuitous, or it was amazing how well this study predicted that because 2 of them had already been had already arrived. But one thing that I'm particularly worried about is this scale right here. This picture I have is Iceria seychellarum, the Seychelles scale. This is a big chunky giant scale insect. It's literally what the family's called, giant scale insects, that is related to the cottony cushion scale. And this one is spreading all over the Caribbean and South America right now. So I would not be surprised if it arrives in Florida soon as well. So definitely one for you guys to keep an eye out as you are scouting. So scale insect identification typically requires adult females. And a lot of this webinar is for you guys to learn how to detect and control scale insects. But I do want to give you some resources on, if you have a particularly bad infestation or you think that there might be something like out of the ordinary, a new invasive species, or if you recognize one of these kind of limited distribution species where it shouldn't be. I want to tell you a little bit about how you would submit samples to FDACS to be identified by us to ensure that it's not a new invasive species or that one of our invasive species isn't like expanding its range. So generally, scale insect identification requires adult females. A lot of the males are not described at all. So it's only 5% of the adult males of the mealybugs have even been described by science. So a lot of times we'll get adult males in traps and we can't identify them at all. Some immatures can be identified, but that is rare. So generally, I'm looking for adult females when I'm doing identifications. So an example would be like Croton scale. I think a lot of times you'll see the male pupae or the nymphs on the underside of the leaves. But actually what's needed are these big green gherkins on the stems here, or on the mid vein of the plant. So the adult females for identification. Similarly, on the right here, I have coconut mealybugs. So you can see there's a lot of different nymphs up here in the top right corner, but I would need these big chunky adult females to be slide mounted for identification if I were to need to put a species name on them. So a lot of times the male pupae or those kind of sessile, immobile, immature males that are about to become the winged form. A lot of times those are the more conspicuous form. Like in the armored or hard scales, a lot of times the male pupae of those are really bright white, whereas the females are like a light brown. And this can be problematic because I'll get like in the male just a bunch of male pupae, and a lot of times they're even empty, like the males are long gone and I can't identify those. So just understanding the differences between those life stages, where we're looking for adult females rather than immatures or males for identification. And a lot of times to fix this, it's just a matter of sending in a lot of plant material. I'm not necessarily expecting people to be able to differentiate them in the field, but just sending in an ample amount of plant material and understanding that sometimes the males are settling on the underside of the leaves, whereas the adult females are actually living on the stems, and just kind of getting a good amount of plant material so that we can look at it under the microscope. So this is a kind of a cool infestation here on a palm. We have an adult female mealybug next to some male pupae for that mealybug, and then a bunch of coconut scale, which is an armored or hard scale. So just realizing that there's oftentimes mixed infestations, meaning that there's multiple species of scale insects on the same plant. And a lot of times we can't really see that in the field very well until we pull some plant material in and look at it under the dissecting scope in the lab. This is tulip tree scale. That's really common on magnolia. So again, this one will be where a lot of times the females are on the stems of the tree, but then the male pupae are on the underside of the leaves. And I'll just get like the male pupae in the male, but I really need those adult females that are on a different part of the plant. So again, when collecting scales, to have an expert identify them, you want a good amount of plant material in a plastic bag. I suggest throwing in a dry paper towel to reduce mold growth, to soak up some of the moisture that the plant is producing. And yeah, getting them in the mail in a timely manner so they're not just molding in the bag. So this is more like a slide that's geared towards our inspectors when I'm training our inspectors on how to send in good samples. But again, it's interesting to get like big bags of plant material because a lot of times mixed infestations are missed in the field. I think that scale on mango that we just first found for the first time in this hemisphere in January probably would have been missed if just leaves were sent in, because they were so hard to see on the stems that it was really necessary to look at them under a dissecting microscope. Again, getting the correct life stage for identification. You want adult females. So it could be important to have enough plant material to find an adult female, especially if it's the wrong time of year and most of them are still immature. Specimens can be lost. Sometimes people want to know if they're alive or dead, like if they've been doing a pesticide treatment and they're not sure if all of the armored scales on the plant are alive or dead because they're under their waxy covers, then sometimes they'll send that in for me to determine. So it'll be important to have a good sample to make that determination. A lot of times when I get bags of scales, I'll be able to rear out parasitoid wasps or to observe natural enemies interacting with scales. So it can kind of be like a little like a microcosm in a bag. So how to determine whether an armored scale, for instance, is alive or dead? So, is your pesticide application working? Do you have evidence of natural enemies or parasitoids? So with armored scales, that cover or that test needs to be flipped over. And one easy way to know if you're dealing with an armored scale is that the exuvia or the exoskeletons are incorporated into the cover. So as armored scales shed their skin, they actually put their skin into their waxy cover. And that is the best way to figure out if you are dealing with an armored scale, or you might know them as hard scales in the family Diospididae. It's the only family of scale insects that does this, that puts their shed skin in there. So in this instance, on the Florida red scale, these like lighter red circles here in the middle, those are the old exoskeletons. This is false oleander scale, and this one's even easier to see because in their cover or their test, the old exoskeletons are dark brown. So you can see on my cursor here, pointing to those exuvia or exoskeletons. And you can see that that white cover had to be flipped over to expose the body underneath. and she's not attached to that test or cover. She's under there with her eggs and sometimes with her first instar crawlers, those nymphs. So one thing that is also one way to also tell if they're dead or alive is sometimes you have these really transparent tests or covers. So this is the coconut scale that's pretty common on palms. And you can see that their cover is so transparent that you can actually see the adult female body underneath, as well as her eggs. But again, just looking for these exuvia, so these exoskeletons that are incorporated into the cover, we know automatically that that is an armored scale or a hard scale because of that. So if you have, if you're trying to get a specimen identified, you need to be careful because if you only have one and you pop that cover off, a lot of times the female could dislodge. She's just attached to the plant with her mouth parts. So she doesn't have any legs. The armored scales, the adult females lose their legs entirely. So she's essentially just anchored with like a leash with her mouth. So if you're too rough, you can just pop her right off the plant and she can just like yeet off into the universe and the specimen will be entirely lost. So that's another reason that I encourage people to send in plant material so that this delicate process can be done under a microscope and not in the field, because even I lose specimens in the field all the time. They're just very, very tiny and easy to pop off accidentally. So what happens to scales? I mentioned earlier that to study scale insects, they have to be slide mounted. So they go through this process of heating up KOH or potassium hydroxide to kind of melt and wash out all of the guts and wax. We need that wax removed because if you're trying to look at a waxy scale insect under a microscope, it kind of impedes the view of all of the important morphological characters that I need to be able to see. So again, those are those little tubes of, ducts, the pores that they are using to make wax that is so important to be able to identify them to species. So how to submit an insect sample to FDAX. If you think that you have something interesting that needs an identification, I've got this link. I think that you guys are going to get the PowerPoint at the end, or I can ask John to send out the PDF of it anyways for you guys to get this link. So one particularly useful thing that's still in this PowerPoint that is very, very long and I won't get through entirely today, but I have a field key at the very end of this. So it's essentially how to try to identify scale insects to family in the field. And you guys might find that a little bit interesting if you're just trying to narrow them down for pest control purposes, because treating armored scales versus treating mealybugs might be different because armored scales can be a little bit more resistant because of their test or cover. But I think, the armored scales are the most speciose group. You're going to be easily able to identify them because they've incorporated their exoskeleton into that test or that waxy cover that they make. Whereas mealybugs and soft scales, they're kind of more free living. They don't have like a little lid on top of them. They're just kind of producing the wax like straight out of their bodies, essentially. But there are definitely more resources in this PDF, so I will try to get John to send it to all the participants. But I think that I've got a few minutes. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole into starting to talk more specifically about every family. I think that's probably just a lot of information overload. So I will go ahead and open up the floor to any questions that you guys may have now.
So if anyone's got questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can, if I don't know if you've got time, Dr. Powell, at the end too. Like there might be more time for more general Q&A as well, if depending on how things shape up towards the end of the next hour. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
can definitely stick around and answer questions towards the end if you guys want to go ahead and get going on the second talk. That's totally fine with me.
yeah, and if anybody wants to put questions like in the chat, like you can either do that now, or if you want to save them for later, you can put them in for the chat, and I'll try to revisit the chat as well at that point. But yeah, I think you've got one here. Can you see the chat right now, Dr. Powell?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
So the question is, do insecticide treatments use potassium hydroxide? So do they use KOH? Um, that's a good question. I feel like, sorry, talking too much, not enough water. Um, I don't like potassium hydroxide is kind of just like like I don't think it would necessarily kill things very quickly. It's kind of like we kill the scale insects in alcohol first, and then they're put into that KOH concentration to clean them out. But I don't know of any. I don't know much about pesticide, formulas at all. That's definitely a question for Dr. Osborne.
I don't
But I
think
don't.
so.
Yeah, I don't believe it's mostly just an agent for cleaning things once they're already dead.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah, and like I said, if you guys got questions, hang on to them or put them in the chat. We'll try to revisit them. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and pass off to the next presentation here. We'll have Dr. Lance Osborne, so UF, Mid Florida Research Education Center. And with that, go ahead and pass it off to you, Dr. Osborne.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. A quick note that being here in Florida, you guys are lucky. You have some of the world's premier taxonomists working at FDACs that other states don't have access to. And so we're really lucky to have this kind of resource. And I rely on them almost daily. So it is very important to understand that and support FDACs when you can. Okay, Phantasma scale. Uh, I work in a research center in the Orlando area, and luckily this particular pest has not reached us. So most of what I have is stuff from the literature, making quick trips down to South Florida to survey and look at the problem. So secondhand knowledge, distance learning, not the best. But when we have an invasive species like this, we're not supposed to move it, not supposed to move it out of the county or the location where it's at. So we have to be very careful to not be part of the problem instead of the solution. Uh, Scale does pose a threat to nursery and landscape industries as well as the homeowners. It would be listed as being polyphagous, according to the standard that was mentioned earlier. So it is an issue and something that we have to pay attention to. Now, initially, when we have an invasive species, everybody gets very upset and scared and worried about what's this going to do and how is this going to impact. I think that we are not seeing nearly the issue that we had a couple years ago with the quarantine of nurseries and people worrying about this spreading and causing impact on trade. One of the first things that we need to pay attention to is scouting. You need to know what you have, what you're dealing with, and you need to be able to, foremost of all, is identify what might be killing them, and whether the chemicals are doing it or whether you have natural enemies. So scouting is very, very important. When I talk to people about scouting this particular insect, I talk to them about finding the eggs, looking for crawlers, try to determine when a large portion of the scales are in the crawler stage, because these are the most easily controllable part of the life cycle. So you need to try to time your control efforts for the crawler stage. You definitely need a hand lens because they're very small, and you need to be able to see whether or not they're alive, they're dead, and that sort of thing. I recommend getting good hand lenses. Okay, sometimes you'll go to a trade show and somebody will hand you a little tiny plastic one. They really just don't have the resolution and resolving ability that a glass particular hand lens would have. I get mine from Fisher. You can get them from photo shops and that sort of thing to get a good one. It'll cost you some money, but it's well worth it, especially when your livelihood depends on doing a proper identification. talking about scouting, there's a brand new commercial ornamental nursery scouting manual, which does have enough material that it would help you scout in a landscape and that sort of thing. This is you have to pay for it. I have the links to these on my website, and I'll give you the how to get to the website easily later on in my talk. But it is, like I said, it's just been released. It has Dr. Billy Crow talking about nematodes, Xinwen Chin, whoops, talking about some abiotic factors. We got Dr. Marble talking about weeds, Dr. Norman, insect or diseases, and myself talking about insects and mites. One thing that we recommend, especially trying to identify peaks of crawlers, is one aspect of doing this is you can put a piece of double-sided sticky tape around a stem or an infested leaf and come back in a week or so and look to see whether or not you've collected any crawlers, and you try to track the number of crawlers on those individual stems by putting some kind of red tape or some way so you can find these things again once you put them on. And then you come back to see whether or not the population is decreasing or increasing. You try to go to the same area consistently because, again, the crawler stage is this stage that you try to aim your chemicals at. And so you need to know whether there's a peak coming, which is the time that you really want to get your ducks in a row for treating your plants. This is a piece of tape, and these are crawlers that are stuck to it. So that's what you're looking for. They're easy enough to pull off, and you don't have to, it's not a problem. Most people don't even know they're there. And like I said, most of the time I have a hard time even finding them once I put them out. But I mean, you can do it better than I, obviously. Identification, trying to see what you're dealing with. Now, we got a lot of good information in the previous talk, so I spelled that wrong. Anyway. So we have armored scales or hard scales, we have soft scales, and then we have mealybugs. They're all in the same group. Again, like Erin was mentioning, we have the immature stage, feeding stage, or adult stage underneath some sort of protection along with the eggs. And it's usually covered by some kind of protection. Whether this protection is an integral part of the insect body or whether it is like in an armored scale, it's underneath is all this protection, and there's and when you flip it over, you still have the insect laying there. Okay, as opposed to the waxy material and powdery coverings on mealybugs. Damage from soft scales and mealybugs. Again, they feed on the phloem sap, produce honeydew, which is usually the first signs of feeding. You also look for aphids because they're going to be they're in a greenhouse, in a nursery, or in a landscape doing something. They have to make a living. And a lot of times, if you track them to where they're going, you'll either find the colony or you'll find some sort of insect that they're feeding on. Okay. Generally, they goes a slow general decline in the population, especially hard because armored scales, because they can have maybe just one generation up to 3 or 4 per year versus say like a mealybug that can have multiple generations in a fairly short amount of time. We find mealybugs actually in our greenhouses killing them. They can build up populations so rapidly, whereas the scales do take a little bit longer. The environmental stresses are accentuated as a result of some of the scale feeding pressure. Okay, soft scales will go through this fairly quick. Again, you need to know what it looks like when you pop it over. There's not a body there. and so they're soft, they're fleshy, they contain fluids. So when you squash them, you get the liquid come out, or the body fluids. You can use your thumbnail. You can use a little piece of like a popsicle stick and rub it across the scales, and you will see that at the end there'll be a number of bodies and with the fluid on it, just to see whether or not you're dealing with a live population or a dead one. If you use a microscope or a hand lens, you can just use a pin or something easy to poke them or to try to dislodge them. Sometimes when you pop them over, you're not going to see much of anything. In this case, is a soft scale that's been parasitized, and you don't see the eggs or anything like that. Whereas the ones that are healthy, you will often see crawlers and eggs and that sort of thing. So around these soft scales, you can see there's sooty mold. You can see the outline of where the female was. These are basically the remnants, I think, of eggs that have hatched. Here's some eggs here and crawlers. Okay, hard scales or armored scales is what we're really talking about today. And again, just a stylized life cycle, but you're looking at the females here are the ones that we're most concerned with. They're the ones that are laying all the eggs, and you want to see if you're killing them or not. Again, underneath the test or the covering is where the eggs are. And you can see, obviously, there's the telltale signs. Sometimes you'll see a very long streak where they've been feeding on the not on the vascular system, but they're feeding on the cells and intercellular fluids and that sort of thing. They do not produce honeydew, and it's important to understand this because the soft scales and the mealybugs, they tap into the vascular system and they get so much liquid that they have to put it out the back end. While they're taking in all those fluids, those fluids are often, when we're trying to manage these things, we'll have the pesticides in, if it's a systemic, that gets into the insect and kills them. And they have to get a certain amount or a certain titer of that insecticide in those fluids in order to kill them. When they're feeding on cell contents and that sort of thing, they just don't get the level of the toxicant in hard scales or armored scales. They just don't take in that much fluid, and they just don't really often or as easily reach the level of material that will kill them. That's why certain neonics will kill a soft scale or a mealybug, but they don't kill the hard scale. Okay. You notice the damage, yellowing of the leaves. You see the little streaks. Leaves may drop. The discoloration at the feeding sites, aesthetic damage by the presence of the scales. People may refuse to buy your product even when the scales are dead because it just doesn't look good. Mentioned earlier, plant vigor. You lose plants just by being stressed, and the stunting of the host and even death. Okay, this is a hard scale. This is Florida red scale. And again, you can see the streaks going out from, and these can be very long. They can, it's amazing how long the mouth parts on these insects are. Again, most of the insects may be on the underside, but do you see the damage on the top of the leaves in this particular palm? Here again is the Florida red scale and the healthy female right there. So when you pop it over, there's the female. You'll see some crawlers, maybe some eggs if it's healthy. Sometimes when you pop them over, basically you see something like this, and that's just a dead insect or maybe a dead parasite. Here you can see a round circular hole. Just remnants of probably a parasitized female. Whoops. Again, these are all the males, these white, okay? And then the females are these longer, lighter colored, brown colored to yellow. sometimes we'll see this. This is not any kind of scale insect. In fact, it's not an insect at all. It's the basically result of having shotgun fungus in the soil. It's when it shoots up these masses that stick to the leaf or whatever, even the pot or whatever, whatever it hits, and it sticks. And basically, when you flip them over, they're just going to have the contour or whatever their substrate was that they were stuck to. So a lot of times, if it's a flat surface or the pot, it'll be a smooth, glassy surface. So it just takes on the characteristics of whatever it was stuck to. We have people applying insecticides trying to control these. And again, it's not going to work. It doesn't, you don't have an insect. You have to deal with the fungus in the soil. Okay, management, chemicals. Now, because this particular pest, and I deal mostly with nurseries, is because it's an invasive species, because it's still considered, as far as I know, an actionable pest, we have to deal with the pesticides. There's just no two ways around it. We don't have biological controls at this point that we can get to a level that would allow a crop to be sold being grown strictly under biological control. That doesn't mean we can't rely on it, but we need to be cognizant of the fact that we're probably going to have to look at chemical control. Obviously, we put in a lot of disclaimers. I'm going to talk about pesticides, but you need the label is the law. You don't apply it into a situation that isn't covered by the label, and you need to pay attention to the label on the product that you're applying it. You don't use a previous bag that you may have purchased. We have some people that were using one compound, and the company decided to change the label, didn't tell anybody, and they were still following the label of the older sack that they had in the warehouse, but they were using new material and they got cited for it. So you have to pay attention to what's on that particular bag or container. Okay, when we're fighting this particular scale, one of the major issues is getting good coverage. And there's a lot of things that impact coverage, and I'll talk about a few of these things. Okay, first is just sheer density. Okay, they're piled up on top of each other. Okay, they're obviously they must be reaching somewhere where they can get food and that sort of thing, but they can be, they can be out in a pile here and stick their mouth parts in and feed on a cell at a good distance away. So they may be covered not just by their own protection, but they've got 2 or 3 other scales covering parts of their body as well. And so trying to get a chemical, especially when the palm is really tall and you have them like this, and trying to get it underneath the leaves, having to worry about the foliage and where it's at. In this case, trying to spray a pesticide on the outside of a hotel room with the air conditioning vents here, you're limited in what you can do as far as spraying. Okay, we can talk about bark treatments. In some cases, we can talk a little bit about soil applications, and drenching, but those have shown to be very iffy at best. Okay, trying to spray again in another hotel parking lot, the car underneath the tree limits their ability of a pesticide company when they show up to make an application of just exactly what they can do. Again, in a the patio where people are eating, with the tables and that sort of thing, you're limited, and at least if you're trying to follow the label and be safe, you're limited in what you can do here as well. A lot of times, and we've had this hesitancy by a lot of people that are making pesticide applications, is that they don't want to use one of the most effective materials, which is oil. They don't want to use it because they're afraid of what they might do to the plants underneath. So we recommend that there's enough replication in these areas where you could go to one or two plants and treat a portion of the plant. You don't have to treat the whole landscape or every plant in the parking lot, but you can basically treat one area and see if it's safe to use it. Now, we have talked to some major companies national companies that do manage people's property, and they've had very good success with oils and very few uh, problems with phytotoxicity. But you have to pick the right oil, and you have to test it for yourself to make sure that it will give you the level of control and lack of damage that you demand. But they are something that you're going to have to pay attention to because of the level of efficacy and results we've seen. Again, just the same point. Those plants need to be tested. Uh, why are they hard to kill? Why the uh, one? I don't understand it so much exactly all of the morphology and that sort of thing, but in this particular species, it has an extra layer of shed skin that the female is encased in, which just gives her just another layer that the pesticide has to penetrate in order to get to the body and to kill the insect. Okay, now if it's systemic, they're just dealing with trying to get it through the mouth parts. But when you're doing a topical or a contact spray, again, it just this particular insect is harder than other hard scales or armored scales. Okay, so they're protected or covered by other scales. They're living on the underside of leaves or on the tops of the leaves or in the crown or in areas that are hard to get to, such as in parking lots and in atriums, around your pool at home, your neighbor overhanging your neighbor's property. So you run into some issues of just trying to treat, even with something that you might be able to get control with. They're covered with a lot of different cast skins, and they're also covered by their own adult skin. Okay, now when we start looking at chemical controls, one way that we get new materials to use in the ornamental industry is through what's called the IR4 program, Interregional 4 project. And this is a government funded program that pays scientists around the country to evaluate pesticides both for efficacy and phytotoxicity. So most labels that are showing up nowadays have gone through this process. And in the process, every year, and they just finished it up for identifying what they want to look at this year. This is not, that didn't, okay. There is a IR4 report. Okay, here's environmental horticulture looking at scale efficacy. Okay, so when you go down and look at this, it's amazing. There's hundreds of pages, about not quite 200, 175 pages or something like that, of all these different compounds named, and you can go to the source and it'll tell you how well it worked on different scales, and just summary of their efficacy and phytotoxicity. And then there's certain scales in here that they've tested these materials on. And then there's soft scales, there's pit scales, palm scales. One that we're most interested in the armored scales, group of armored scales here, is the T scale, which is a close relative of the palm scale. And so when you, or not palm scale, the Phantasma scale. So when you look at the results of T scale, we have the same scientist, the same population of scales that he used to infest the crop, and then generally the same crop. And we can get varied results. I mean, the same compound, everything's the same, and do the same experiment over a couple times, and the results sometimes are totally different. And so there's so much variability in the data that it makes it hard to go to, you just, if you run one experiment, it's hard to just make any kind of claims that this is going to be an effective material. And you don't want to be having, people spending thousands of dollars for $30,000, whatever, for a homeowners association to take care of their scale. So we have a hard time making recommendation based on the data. We can look at it and see trends, and so we come up with kind of our best guess estimate of what might work and be a logical route to try. You can look at these all yourself. There's links in a PowerPoint and a PDF file that I have for this talk that you can download and look at these things for yourself. And you can look at the phytotoxicity patterns and that sort of thing. Okay. We did produce a management guide, which is also linked in our PowerPoint that will be posted. I'll give you the link to it before we're done. And we have a number of different compounds, and you'll notice that each color is a different mode of action. These are the 4As. There's a 4D that's white. It has some similar chemistry to neonics, but it is considered a little bit different. We have distance, which is a growth regulator that people are saying is looking fairly good for scale control, which is not systemic, so you have to get good coverage to get it to work. Talus, again, is another one that people are recommending, especially if you have natural enemies around. It's another insect growth regulator. Mainspring, different category. So gives you materials that you can rotate, because we've already seen resistance, not in this particular scale, but in a number of other scales, to the neonics being overused. So you really need to look at 2 or 3 materials to rotate with. Again, the oils, these are the ones that people have found to be relatively safe. So again, this chart with the rates is on a handout that you can download yourself. There are some newer materials, but unfortunately, one that looks good can't be used on landscape ornamentals or in urban landscape, where it's okay for nurseries probably, but not for managing them in, say, a homeowners association or large area or a hotel or that sort of thing. Okay. So this is, I'm more than giving you a straight answer. Some of this you're going to have to go through and look at for yourself and make a decision. Systemic insecticides can provide variable or sporadic control. You have to realize that the palm has a different kind of vascular system than most other plants. Okay, it doesn't have a cambium, which other documents have said hard scales feed in the cambium. Well, if you don't have cambium, where are they feeding? Well, they're feeding on individual cells. And again, they're probably not getting the level of insecticide that they're getting if they were feeding on the phloem. We found, and I'll talk in a minute, that some of these areas where the scale was first found, one place in particular, which is down in Coral Gables, where the USDA has a facility, a research facility. They have germplasm of a number of different palm trees, or not palm trees, but palms, that have been there for a number of years. They followed the scale populations, and basically they didn't make any treatments, and the populations got to a point, but they never really did any significant damage to the trees or the palms. Okay, that the scientist who was working down there, Dr. Rhoda, felt that they were getting substantial biological control. There's a number of different natural enemies and I'll show some pictures in a few minutes, but it is an option, and it just depends on what kind of pressure you're under to make the treatment. And but some of the insecticides that we listed on the handout, like I said, the two growth regulators, which is distance and talus, and then the oils are relatively safe to to use if you have activity and significant activity of the natural enemies. Again, the problems with getting good coverage leads to you may spray with something and just knock out the natural enemies, and then you end up with even a larger population. And we do have some data to show that, where you can actually end up making an application and end up with more scales feeding on your plants because you've killed the natural enemies. You have to realize, man, I'm pushing the wrong buttons today. The resurgence of armor scale populations due to the sprayed, and in some cases, we know that insecticides, when you hit an insect, they may respond by producing more eggs. We did a study recently on thrips, and we sprayed chili thrips. We ended up having a larger population on the treated plants than we did on the untreated plants. And this is mainly with a synthetic pyrethroid, knocked off all the natural enemies. And I guess some people say that the insect responds by producing more uh, uh, immatures or eggs, and it's called hormone-lygosis. And that may be what we're seeing with some of these things. The crawlers are spread by wind on contaminated equipment, animals, and again, people. Oils are an important tool because they are primarily contact insecticides with short residual activity, and so that you can attack the crawlers, and which again is the most sensitive stage. These are cheaper than some of the traditional pesticides like the neonics. It has major phytotoxicity has been a major concern, but a few large landscape, like I mentioned earlier, report little impact when using oils, negative phyto, and they're pleased with the level of control. Now you have to follow label instructions. You have to test for phyto. You have to pay very close attention to don't mix it with other materials, because they can have a very negative result with some phytotoxicity if you hit them with any kind of metal in say a fungicide or stuff like that. So again, you need to follow the label. Is it sustainable? Data would say that it probably isn't, because some of the major scale problems that they've had, and some of the street trees and that sort of thing in other parts of the country where they're trying to manage certain scale and hard scale insects, the frequency of use of some of these materials led to resistance. And then again, then you start losing the few tools that you actually do have. Biological control. I spend most of my time working on biological control, but there's a time and a place. And when we have a quarantinable pest that we're trying to limit its spread, we just have to hold our breath. We don't have anything we can buy to release. We haven't identified anything with that would be worth trying to mass rear and sell. The father of biocontrol basically hit it on the nail on the head. When we kill off the natural enemies of a pest, we inherit their work. We've got to, so if we start killing out all the natural enemies, we're got to step in to try to rectify the problem. Okay, these four natural enemies. One's called the scale picnic beetle. Predatory mites, little tiny fly, the larval stage is a predator, and then little tiny wasps like we see on white flies and other insects. These are attacking the hard scale, and they're asserting a certain level of control. There's just a whole array of things from caterpillars that feed on the scales. There are other predatory thrips. There are pathogens and that sort of thing. These particular ones that I'm showing here in this slide were found in every species of palm that Dr. Rhoda sampled, and in every county where she went and looked. So there's a good contingency of natural enemies. We're just not sure, how to increase their efficacy, or what might be slowing them down from managing the, the scale at a level that we can tolerate. She has some data to show that the palms are doing just fine, just relying on these natural enemies, but that's on a USDA facility where they weren't spraying, and they could tolerate a little bit of damage initially. A couple other ones that are commonly found, syrphid larvae. We find these, both of these natural enemies feeding on whiteflies back when we had Rugose spiraling whitefly. So there's a lot of indigenous or natural enemies present in the environment. We just have to figure out how to colonize them, how to, whether we what can we do to conserve them in a natural environment? And so it's going to be careful of not applying insecticides for other issues that the palms have. So basically, what questions would I ask myself when trying to put together a program for managing this particular scale insect? Okay, the first thing is just to evaluate the tree, see if it's unsightly, if it's something that has to be taken care of. Consult an arborist to see if the damaged and infested material can be removed, or whether this is something that needs an immediate response. What percentage of the scales are alive on the remaining fronds or leaves? We have the problem with scales. When they die, they don't fall off immediately. It takes a while, if at all. And so you don't really know whether all those scales you're seeing are alive or dead. In some cases, they are, a significant portion are dead, and there's no need to be panicking and treating with pesticides. Can you prune it out? Is there pressure washing that could knock the scales off? Just something else other than applying a pesticides. Sometimes large portion of dead with previous treatment or biological controls, or maybe some other factor that we don't know exactly what it was. Like I said, we found a lot of infected scales from insect pathogenic fungi. Are biological controls present on the remaining plant material? So to see if you are keeping a resident population there that you might be able to rely on in the future. Does the population or the infestation seem to be getting stable? I mean, worse? Is it stable? Or is the population declining? You try to monitor this with either the sticky tape, or look at the same fronds or same plant material over time, so you have an idea whether it's increasing, decreasing, or staying the same. Can it be left alone until another evaluation is made? Don't need to make the decision today. Can I wait? If not, do you want to nuke it? Basically, take something that's very heavy duty and going to disrupt everything in order to save the tree. And there are cases where that's going to be the decision. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we try to get you to look at the other things prior to making that decision. Or do you want to treat with other softer chemicals like oil, distance, or talus to conserve natural enemies? If yes, make sure that you don't use a pyrethroid. And some of the neonics, and so, the acephate or orthene shows efficacy, but we're not really sure, you're going to disrupt the biocontrols. Neighbors are probably going to scream bloody murder if you're using acephate because it smells so bad. So you have to put all these things together and make a logical decision of what you want done. A lot of homeowners will ask or these types of questions, or at least they should be asking the people treating their property these questions so they can make an informed decision. Do you see many crawlers and eggs? Best time to apply. This is something where we're lacking research. There's some things that we need to get to the bottom of so we can help you make logical decisions. We need to have somebody out on a regular basis down in South Florida looking at these populations of scales to see, how can we predict when there's going to be crawlers present. Okay, there's some ways that we can do this. Once we find some crawlers that we have, say, a peak of crawlers emerging, then we start counting day degrees, which is the amount of the temperatures over a certain level over time. It's used a lot in main agriculture, where you can predict the peaks of, say, the flight of a moth for 2-3 years in advance. And you can get it almost to the day by monitoring the temperature. You can look at phenological events, say a certain plant puts out flowers at this time each year. Well, this is almost coincident with the time when we used to get the crawlers coming out. So you can look at phenological events in other plants and other biological systems to be a key or an indicator of what might be going on in and related with the scale. The insects, basically, their biology is driven by temperature. Say at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, they don't develop at all below that. But as the temperature rises above it, they start accumulating day degrees. And at a certain point, certain things will happen in the biology. They'll molt to the next stage. They'll start laying eggs. They'll start to fly. Eggs will start to hatch. We need to see if we can find some efficient biological controls or what we might do to help them become more efficient. Now, I mentioned funding and I mentioned research. There is one research project that is being funded by FNGLA and to Dr. Adam Dale. He has a team. I know that we have Dr. Mayor on the line on helping support this. What happened? And Erin, Dr. Powell, and then this is the graduate student that's doing the work. And they may need some cooperators. They may need some help. And so if you're interested in talking to these people that are kind of working on this scale, please contact them, and I will help get you to the right people. The overarching goals of their project are to determine the primary factors facilitating the invasion and success in South Florida, develop planting and recommendations to guide urban landscape and plant selection if say you're going to have to redo a landscape, and then identify management strategies to effectively suppress this particular scale. I mentioned that we have a lot of different websites and things that are available. If you do a search of Phantasma scale and Osborne, it comes up with my website. You go scroll down, you'll see a resources. You do that. There's a field detection of potential host plants of this scale, potential pest palms and ornamental plants in Florida. There's a chemical control guide that I mentioned. There's a pest alert that was originally sent out when this pest was first found. There's a large PowerPoint similar to the one that we're doing today that's could be downloaded. I have a PDF file and a PowerPoint file of this talk that I'll put on later. The IR4 efficacy thing for scales. And then there is an excellent presentation, a PDF file by Dr. Crenshaw, who retired from Colorado. His scale PowerPoint, or I guess it's a PDF file, is outstanding, and it'll go through some of the chemical stuff and some of the issues with this managing this particular group of organisms. And with that, I'm done. A little bit early, is shorter than I expected, but I don't know that much more to give you. So we can open it up for questions.
Yeah. Hey, folks, if you've got questions, go ahead, unmute yourself. You can throw them out there right now. I guess, yeah, we'll give it 4 or 5 minutes here, and then I'll go ahead and launch the quiz too after that. I saw that some of the questions that were coming up like got addressed through the chat feature, but I'll go ahead and if you're thinking of questions, okay, here I've got one coming up here. I'm just going to go ahead and launch the quiz too, but you can go ahead and we'll hold a discussion while the quiz is going on as well. Let me go ahead and just launch the quiz. Okay, some of the questions are coming up here, but I've launched the quiz as well. Go ahead and take your time on that. It'll be sitting there for anybody that's able to see that pop up. So first question here, is it possible we can give some help on oh, no, that's the next one. Any research publications trying to use of native plants versus ornamental in order to discourage invasive pests?
I replied to that one in the comments, but if I don't know necessarily about a Phantasma scale specific resource, but generally we find that invasive plants or non-native ornamentals, basically like plants that occur in the native range of invasive insects, can kind of promote their establishment and success. So this concept is called invasional meltdown. So if you think about like spotted lanternfly, it's really preferring like hosts from its native range now that it's here in the US. And we find that also to be true with scale insects. So I have a paper that came out recently about some invasive scale insects that occur on Chinese tallow. And we kind of talk a little bit about that, how a lot of times when a new species shows up in an area, it really just like loves to go to its native range hosts first, and that can really help it get going in a new territory and kind of make things worse. So another kind of point towards planting more natives. And a lot of our native scales are really not pests. We do have plenty of native scales that will specialize on native species, and they're not only uh, not really exploding as pests, but they also have a natural suite of biological controls already, present in their native range.
That's interesting. I kind of think of, like with spotted lanternfly and some of these that like they're able to exploit the, uh, basically like the native plants don't have defenses a lot of the time. And so it's interesting. You're kind of saying that sometimes these non-natives act as a refuge kind of like, or as a food source. Okay.
Yeah, I think that kind of like letting them get going and then they start like jumping on to other hosts. And yeah, like then you have the issue of the native plants that have never seen that pest before. And I don't know as much about like the plant side of things, but just thinking about how like plants can actually like call to natural enemies when they have a pest show up. And that whole relationship getting disturbed by invasive species where they don't really even know what natural enemy to call to, if you will.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Next question. Is acephate approved for residential use in South Florida?
I think the ACE cap thing, the tree injections, I think those are registered. I'd have to double check. I don't think there's any difference between South Florida and North Florida. I mean, it's by the state, and I'd have to. I can double check that.
Yeah, that would, I think, yeah, you gotta check the label and and I guess state laws. I haven't heard anything different in terms of regions of the state.
I think the one where it's confined to being put into the tree. I think that's, and I don't recommend drenching anything with acephate.
Hmm.
I've not read a drench level, but we know that putting acephate in the soil can cause a lot of phytotoxicity.
Yeah. I got another question here from Henry. Um, any example of scale insecticide resistance in the landscape?
I don't think anybody's doing that in Florida, but definitely out. I think Crenshaw, Colorado did some work. He references, I think, a couple of cases with imidacloprid.
That makes sense. Yeah. Let's see. Crepe myrtles are popping up everywhere in South Florida. What scales do you see, if any, on crepe myrtles being problematic?
I had one slide on crepe myrtle bark scale. That's our most concerning one. It's only present in the landscape in the extreme north panhandle right now. There was a population that popped up in Leon County, but essentially this one is a problem because when these like new housing developments are just plopping in a bunch of crepe myrtle, they're sourcing it from Alabama, North Carolina, other states that are cultivating a lot of crepe myrtle and have like major infestations of crepe myrtle bark scale that first arrived from Asia to Texas a few years ago. So crepe myrtle bark scale is definitely the one that I find to be most problematic. But there are other scales that will go after crepe myrtle. We've got like Japanese maple scale, Lophioleucaspis japonica, was one of the armored scales that feeds on crepe myrtle that I've identified recently. And yeah, it's also crepe myrtle also has an aphid that specializes on it.
I got one that was sent here directly to me. It doesn't say specific species, but just palms in general. So I don't know if it's about palm scale or phantasma scale, but like are all species susceptible to those two?
There's definitely a preference. We found a number of just didn't get nearly the infestation levels, so there is a difference. And I don't have that data right here in front of me, but
I've got one. What is killing live oak trees in Palm Beach County? I guess that might be related to this webinar, but why don't you shoot me an email and we'll talk more about that. We can get more into like arborist issues and like things that we see. Usually insects are not the primary thing though, that if you're seeing dying live oaks. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. And then if Dr. Powell and Dr. Osborne would be so kind, if they could lead the review of the quiz questions here.
okay, you want me
I'll
to
go ahead
deal?
and share. I'm sharing the results now.
Well, first of all, I think I mentioned that the oil is not, it is effective. Okay. And we are not seeing the level of phytotoxicity that would concern us, at least in some of the reports that I'm getting. Number two, we're not really recommending Avid or abamectin for use to control this particular pest. It has a lot of other things that it's great for, but we don't have the efficacy data for Avid on this particular pest. We do recommend some of the top compounds that people are looking at and getting efficacy are Safari, Talus, Sulfoyl X, and Distance. I guess E would be the answer, all of the above.
Yeah, number 4, scale insects
Yeah.
feed on plant xylem. True or false?
So that is false. Some scale insects feed on the plant phloem or the intracellular contents of the plant, but they don't feed on the xylem. The xylem is primarily transporting the water, whereas phloem is where you're going to find all of the sugar. All adult scale insects are wingless. That is also false. Most male scale insects have wings, although there are apterous or wingless males of some species, and also some species that have wingless and winged forms. So a little bit of a tricky one, but generally all females wingless, most males winged. Which group of scale insects incorporates shed skins or the exuvie into their waxy coverings? That is the armored scales. So soft scales will often have like a layer of wax that they're producing, but their exoskeletons are not going to be around necessarily easily found, whereas armored scales are going to incorporate that into the test. So you might have the exuvia incorporated in the center of the test or at the edge of the test, depending on what subfamily those armored scales are in. And then I think 7 is another question from Dr. Osborne.
Okay, those are the ones where Dr. Rhoda found that every species of palm in every county that they surveyed had all of these 4, which is the predatory beetle, the predatory mites, the syrphid larva, no, the cecidomyid, the gall midge, and then the parasitoid. So the answer would be all of the above.
Oh, it was all okay. I'll have to go back and look at that one. But yeah, people went in line with that. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And then I'm going to go ahead and put in the form for getting everyone's CEUs. That should be popping up right now. If you've got any more questions while folks are putting in CEUs, go ahead and put them in the chat. So I guess outside of Phantasma scale, and then I guess this is more for Dr. Osborne, and here in, well, and maybe this is different for different parts of the state. What landscape scale do you see the most with people coming to you about for issues?
Mainly mealybugs. I'm getting more mealybug phone calls from growers and from, I mean, we're trying to manage, for example, parvospinus and looking at biocontrol. The mealybugs take the plants out before we can really get the parasites and things to eat the thrips. So that's one of the things. Dr. Powell, I mean, she probably gets stuff in all the time. She could probably tell you more than.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like what is super, super common and like more problematic like than usual right now. I guess I'm identifying a lot of Farisia, which is a mealybug. Just kind of have had a surge of that. Things like, ebb and flow. Yeah, we haven't had a ton of phantasma. I mean, our Lebec mealybug on citrus is a little bit biased because we have the chirp people that are specifically inspecting citrus groves around the citrus growing regions of the state.
Are you
Um,
seeing it on any ornamentals?
Lebec, no, not really. I had it on cotton in a community garden at a university in St. Pete, but it didn't really seem to do anything from there.
All right. If you were not able to see the window with the polls and quizzes, or the polls and quizzes for getting the CEUs, make sure to just email me. I'll put my email like in the chat here, and I will make sure to process you like with whatever information that you're able to provide me via email for this. But yeah, if you've been able to use the window here, uh, everything's going to be saved with into a file that's connected to the Zoom meeting. I'll be able to check it and get all of your stuff processed here. So and with that, I think we're kind of wrapping up a little bit ahead of schedule here, but that's fine. Give everybody some time to get to their lunches and everything. I'm going to go ahead and just wrap up and end the poll here. And I just wanted to go ahead and thank our two presenters again today. So Dr. Lance Osborne, UF IFAS MREC, Dr. Erin Powell up in FDAX. You up in Gainesville? So
Yes.
where all the magic happens, a lot of it anyway. So and the satellites all over the state here. So, but yeah, very informative. Thank you all. And yeah, we're looking forward to maybe having part 2 of this for next year. I think maybe mealybugs might be on the menu. So, but yeah, thanks everybody, and we'll catch you like in the future here. Take care. Thank you again,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Osborne,
Bye.
Dr. Powell.
Thank you, sir.